Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am really late to make a video of my best reads of 2025, but I thought maybe if people weren't bored of those videos already, they can watch this now and they can spend their Christmas money on getting some of these books. I had a really good run of books in 2025. I think my average rating was around closer to 4 stars, which is pretty good. And I also thought about making a video of my worst books of 2025, but I actually won't be doing that because I just didn't read enough bad books. There were some that I didn't like as much, but most of them I really enjoyed, or I had books that were just not really for me, but I didn't really want to come on and dig into why I didn't like them because it was simply more about me than the book. Just not a really good choice for me. I never have a ton of 5 star books. At the end of the year, I tend to be quite picky with my 5 stars, so I'm also going to include my 4.5 stars kind of as my runners up of the best books of my year. But I do have some really good 5 star reads to recommend to people, so stick around for that at the end of the video. My first 4.5 star read is True Biz. This is set in a deaf school in the US and it follows the lives of some of the students at the school and the head teacher. I think what was really interesting about this novel is how it integrated ASL into the narrative. So obviously most of the characters are communicating in ASL. Some of them also have implants and they are able to hear some spoken language and they're able to communicate through speaking as well. But it's a really interesting insight into deaf culture, and it revolves a lot around the implants as well, and people how people's experiences of that change how they interact with the world, and how there are kind of these positives and negatives of the implants, and the discussion around it, which is something I really didn't know anything about. I also loved how it uses sign language in the novel. You have these pages which give you some of the signs that they're using at particular times, so it tends to weave in really well with what the characters are speaking about. So you kind of get these little drawings of the signs, and it's really connected to how they're communicating. And I also liked how these vitalics and how they pulled that in to show when they're speaking through sign and when they're speaking out loud. It's such a creative and interesting way of portraying different types of communication, and I think it's such a great read for just enjoying the story, but then picking up all of these really interesting aspects of deaf culture. One thing I also didn't know anything about, which they mention, is the way that because of the segregation in schools in the US, Black deaf students kind of created their own signs, and how these have then been integrated back into ASL. But some of them, some of them are only really for Black people to use, which is such an interesting aspect of ASL. And I think overall the novel is so great for understanding how sign language is a language. And I'm personally really interested in how, when you study foreign languages, which I did at university, you understand how different cultures and different communities use they communicate ideas in a different way because of the grammar of the language, because of the connotations of different words. Like you have different jokes, different puns you can make in different languages at a very simple level, but it also affects how you communicate big ideas, and how you interact with people. And that's obviously very true for sign language as well, and for different types of sign language. I live in the UK, and so I mainly have only interacted with BSL rather than ASL, but it was super interesting to find out a bit more about that. It's definitely a really great read if you're interested in language, which I feel like a lot of people are if they are big readers. My second 4.5 star read was actually a childhood favourite that I went back to because of Book Talk, which is I'll Give You the Sun. This I read ages ago. I read it when it came out. I got gifted her other novel, The Skies Everywhere, just for like my birthday or something, and I liked it. I think I didn't relate to it as much. Whereas I'll Give You the Sun, I found I just got completely gripped. But I remember absolutely bawling my eyes out reading it. It is quite sad. It's quite a specific kind of sad, because it's really about missed opportunity and how life doesn't always go in the way that you want it to. And how I think particularly as teenagers, like teenagers can just be mean and be jealous, and you have these big emotions and you don't know what to do with them. Um, and I think it's just, I mean, you can tell from the cover as well, like the way art and the creative process is like pulled into this novel is what I think still really holds up. I was a little bit worried when I reread it that I would actually not engage with it at all and not really enjoy it in the same way that I did when I was younger. But I think the way, so both it revolves around these this brother and sister, and they are both creatives and they're both artists, and that really interacts with how they see the world. It's a really interesting perspective, because they're kind of seeing the world through the lens of painting, and how they can kind of create art from it. And then it revolves around both of their kind of timelines, and how also their relationship changes, and how it's affected by other things that happen to them in their life that affect the both of them as well, and how they respond to that. I think it's a really great novel. She does a really good job of talking about grief, in both her works, and I think there's a reason why it's become popular again. Yeah, for me, it's very much a nostalgic read. So I wasn't sure that I wanted to go in and say that it was, 5 stars, because I'm so biased by how much I enjoyed it when I first read it. But I would definitely recommend it. I think it is one that's popped back up for a reason. Next is Masters of Death. I was quite intrigued to get into Olivie Blake's novels. I know that she's super popular at the moment. I read The Atlas Six in 2024, I think, and I did enjoy it, and so I thought I'd try something else. And yeah, I managed to borrow Masters of Death from the library. I really got into it, but more towards the end, which is why I didn't rate it 5 stars, because I think that you can kind of tell that Olivie Blake came from fan fiction writing, because I feel like from page one, she kind of expects you to love the characters because she does. And I think that's a really fun way of writing, but I think it's a little bit harder to engage with if it's not fan fiction and you don't know who these characters are, because I felt like I was thrown into it, but there was quite a lot of characters and there was quite a lot of relationships happening, and it took me a minute to warm up to who they were. But once I did, and once I got into the story, I really enjoyed it, and I think I enjoyed it more and more as the book went on, and I think I'd also really enjoy rereading it. So I do think it's really worth a read. But I'd be interested to know what other people think about this kind of style, because I do think there could maybe be a little bit more introduction at the beginning. I'm not really sure how she would go about that. That's like kind of an interesting thing I think for me to think about, is how she would write it so that you kind of warmed up to the characters more. But it's really fun. I think the overall plot, I don't want to give too much away, because it's kind of a mystery, and I'm not sure. I read it too long ago now to know exactly what is a spoiler and what isn't. But it is a really fun kind of a fantasy element. Is not high fantasy, it's more like urban fantasy, and you've got these kind of fantastical creatures interacting with the normal world, but there's all these quirky things happening, and a lot of characters that you wouldn't expect to be interacting with each other are all interacting, which is really fun. I think it's a really fun read, and I really enjoyed it, and I would read some more of her work, I think. Speaking of fun reads, my next one is Boyfriend Material and the sequel Husband Material. I got so put off from reading these books because I hated the cover. I think it's really funny because I think I've spoken to people who don't live in the UK, and they they were saying that people outside of the UK really like the British flag, whereas I think if you live in the UK, you see it on stuff and you think that is not a British person who wrote that if it's a book, and it just seemed kind of tacky and touristy. Like if it's just the flag, fine. If you see it on things, like I don't think British people are walking around with their flag, with the UK flag on everything. So yeah, to me it just really stood out as this is an American romanticizing the UK, which is like lovely for US readers, but is not going to be entertaining for a British reader because it's just going to feel like not a good representation of actual life in the UK. Um, but I got recommended it by a friend and I sat and read it, and it's really fun. I think my favorite thing about it is there's this kind of posh character who's just a bit of an idiot, and it was the humor in it was done so well. It's just a really good, fun read if you want a bit of romance, and it's very like queer inclusive. It's a MLM story, but there's also kind of side characters who identify in different ways, and it doesn't feel it's not really about them being closeted or anything. It's just a romance. It's just a fake dating situation. I think that was the other thing is I'm not always a big fan of fake dating, but I think this was done well because I think the problem with fake dating is that you have to have a good reason why they don't just go on one date and then decide that actually they want to get together. There needs to be some kind of barrier for them to stop them from just actually dating. But then it needs to be easy enough that they can overcome it by the end of the novel, which I think is a hard balance to get. But I think this novel did it really well, and it's great because you also have the sequel, so they explore a bit more of that as well in the second one. But mainly it just made me laugh, and I liked it. The next one that I read was Martyr. This was one that I was really excited to read. I saw it, it was all over my social media, and I felt like I just had to read it. And I did really, really enjoy it. I rushed out to buy it, and it has one of my favourite openings of a novel. I think it just really pulls you in, and the prose is just so, so beautiful. The reason I didn't rate it 5 stars was because the more I thought about it, especially after reading it, there's kind of some of the plot feels a bit far fetched. I didn't really understand why some of the choices that were made, and it also has quite an open ending, which I don't always love. I kind of like a an ending where you know what's happened, or at least you can kind of. It depends on the situation, but for me, I didn't love the ending, but I do think other people do. So really it's up to you, but I think it's a very philosophical novel and I really liked that about it. It does a great job of balancing kind of the details of the main character's life and these kind of big ideas that he's thinking about. It revolves around this man who's trying to write a poetry collection about martyrs, of people who've died for a cause, and how he kind of gets fascinated by this idea of people dying for a reason. And surprise, surprise, it is tied into how his own personal life and what's going on with him. Um, but I think it's a really interesting topic to delve into in a novel, and it's just so beautifully written. I really just loved it. I think that the if you like those kind of well written literary novels, it's really really worth a read. I think it was also surprisingly like a lot of fun to read, even though it is a novel that revolves around death and um, kind of and depression and um, yeah, and there's also quite a lot of it ties in as well with this idea of martyrs in Iran, as yeah, the main character's family is from Iran. He's grown up mainly in the US, but he still has this tie back to his country. It's a very beautiful read, and I really do understand why it got so much hype around it, and I think it did mainly live up to that hype. I think it just falls into some of the pitfalls that I find I often have with those kinds of literary novels where they're sometimes a little bit too pretentious for me. I think sometimes I just don't always want a. Sometimes I think they fall more into being a character study or an exploration of a philosophical idea rather than that much of a story. And I think sometimes I want a little bit more story. But that's me. Maybe that's just me. But I love reading them for the prose, and I think if you want to read something that is well written in terms of the language and the metaphors and how ideas are expressed, definitely worth a read. It's really, really beautiful. Finally, for my 4.5-star reads, I have a duology, which is the Radiant Air duology. This is one that I think I probably should rate 5 stars because when I tell you, some of the scenes have just lived rent free in my brain since I read them. Particularly the first one, which is She Who Became the Sun. If you know, you know. There is a scene where there is a betrayal, and I literally gasped. One thing about me is I never see a plot twist coming. I don't even try. I think some people are reading books and they're like, oh, I think maybe this person did it, or I think this is going to happen. I'm just along for the ride, and I don't really pay enough attention to even be trying to guess the plot twist. But this, you do see it coming because it's kind of written in there, but you also don't see it coming. And I did not. I was so shocked that it actually happened how it did. And yeah, it really got me in the feels. Incredible scene, really, really interesting dynamic between those characters, between all the characters. Super interesting. You can also see from my copy of She Became the Sun that I have annotated quite a few pages. There's just so many great scenes in this. The novel starts off with a brother and a sister who are living in poverty in rural China, and they go to a fortune teller and they're told that the brother has this great destiny ahead of him, that he is going to become someone who is powerful, who is rich, and he's going to go on to do great things. Quite soon afterwards, he's then killed, and the his sister decides that in response to kind of what's happening around her, that she decides she's going to take on his destiny, and she is going to disguise herself as her brother and try and get into a monastery, which is her way of kind of working her way up and going on to do these great things that her brother was prophesied to do. And that kind of idea of destiny, and whether you can cheat destiny, whether you can, to what extent you're willing to go to get what you want out of life, is such an interesting and kind of philosophical idea that's built into the narrative. And then you also have this exploration of gender as well, with her disguising herself as a man, and then kind of later on, you're not really sure exactly how the character is feeling about gender and whether they've kind of like become the man that they were pretending to be. There's some really interesting passages about gender as well in there, all within this amazing kind of, it's marketed as a fantasy. Personally, I don't think it's fantasy. I think it's magical realism, but I don't. I mean, call it what you want. It has fantasy elements. There's some of the characters can see ghosts, and there are it is kind of almost a literal imagination of the idea of the divine right to rule and people having this kind of magical power that makes them the ruler. But a lot of it's quite symbolistic, so I don't think, personally, I don't think it's. I wouldn't really describe it as a full fantasy because it doesn't really. It feels more like it's representing something than that. It's very particularly relevant to the plot. Like, I think you could read most of the fantasy elements as being a literary description of something quite perhaps more mundane that is happening. A lot of it's kind of a representation of guilt and loss and people's egos as well, are kind of portrayed through this divine power. Really interesting. And the sequel as well, He Who Traveled the World. I think I kind of enjoyed reading the sequel a little bit more, because I will say the one thing I found difficult about this duology is there is so much happening. There are so many characters, and once you get onto the kind of, there's quite a lot of it revolves around, there's this rebellion happening and there's kind of this war, And I think there's so many factions, even within you've got the kind of the two sides, but then you've got factions within that, and there's also kind of independent people who get involved, and there's all these different perspectives and storylines, which make it such an incredible epic read. But for me, I can be a little bit dumb. I can be a little bit silly. I can not pay attention, and I had to keep going back and being like, "Who's that? What's happening? Why are they important?" So I think maybe I'm just telling you to pay attention. Maybe just pay attention and remember people's names. But I think that it's one that I kind of have grown to love more since I read it, because I keep thinking back to certain scenes and being like, that was incredible. That was really, really great. So I think that if I go back and reread it, I think I might even bump it up to 5 stars, which is why I wanted to do this one last, from the 4.5 stars, because honestly, I probably should have rated them 5 stars. But I can't remember names. And I think some of it just went a little over my head, and that's okay. Onto my 5 star reads. I've got 5, which is actually quite a few, but they're quite varied. So my first 5 star read is Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. I was drawn to this. I saw it online, and I was drawn to it because I've read the poem that it's from. It's from William Blake, and I really got pulled in by that, and from what people were saying about it. It's kind of a funny one as well, because it's not particularly recent, but it kind of popped up again on Book Talk, because I was telling people I was reading it, and they said, "Oh, I read that ages ago." But I missed the boat when it came out, so I had a read of that, and I was reading it on my phone because I borrowed it from the library as an ebook, and I got to a concert by myself, and I was reading it before the band came on, and I literally like had to stop myself from gasping. Like, I think I literally went like this in the middle of the crowd, because I was so shocked by the end. As I've already said, I never guess a plot twist, and it is a mystery, and you do kind of get a reveal at the end, and I was not expecting it. But I think the main thing I loved about this, and I have quite a few quotes that I highlighted, is that the main character is it's a voice that you don't tend to see, which is like an older woman, and she's kind of she's got some very strong opinions, and she comes out with these great lines, really interesting perspective. It was one of those ones where you read it and you feel like you know the character. You feel like you could write the character because you understand them so well. And that for me, why it was 5 stars was because it's such a well-rounded character study, and yeah, it revolves around this woman who's living in this small town, and some of the people in town start mysteriously dying, getting attacked, and they're trying to work out what's happening. It has such great attention to detail, and the characterization is just fantastic. So I really think it's worth reading. It's a great wintry read if you're looking for something while it's still cold and frosty here in the UK. My second 5 star read is a non-fiction pick. I usually don't read a lot of non-fiction. I do try to, and I buy the books, but I find that particularly in the evenings after I finished work, I just don't feel like I have the energy to read non-fiction. So I tend to get through them a lot slower. But my favourite one from last year is Africa is Not a Country. I really wanted to know a bit more about this part of the world, as I didn't really study anything about Africa when I was in school. And I found this was a really great introduction into kind of a mix of contemporary culture and history. I think it's really important to know about colonization, especially as a British person, but it's a really heavy and big topic to cover. And I think sometimes books kind of expect you to already have a certain level of background knowledge, or there's a lot of kind of stats and things that kind of take you out of understanding the story and the impact of what actually happened. But this book does a really good job of looking at the stories of specific histories of different countries, and then also looking at the impact and kind of weaving it also in with the narrative of Africa that we get fed in the UK and in the West about, you know, kind of grouping the whole region together and seeing it as this kind of backwards area where there's just war and famine, and kind of challenging that and looking at the contemporary culture and also looking at, you know, how some of these wars have come about, how we're responsible for a lot of the things that have happened as well, and you know, and then also looking at what the culture was maybe like before colonization as well. So there's kind of a lot of bits that are covered, and I think it was really great overview, and a really good intro into you finding some things that you might be more interested in. But yeah, I'd really recommend it if you're looking for a non-fiction pick and you want to read a bit more about kind of history and culture. My next 5-star read is A Pale View of the Hills by Kazuo Ishiguro. I love Ishiguro, and I simply will rate everything he rates 5 stars. I just think he is a master of just subtlety and dealing with kind of big philosophical topics in a really engaging way, and in a way that makes you actually kind of sit and think about what he's trying to tell you. I just think he's fantastic. So I unsurprisingly loved A Pale View of the Hills. He just writes so well about memory, and that's what a lot of this kind of revolves around. It's quite hard to sum up, but yeah, Ishiguro does such a good job of dealing with memory and with characterization, and I just think it's really subtle, really beautiful, and just another hit from Ishiguro. Is not. I'm going back and trying to read all of his works, and I think I'm about 5 novels in now, so I'm nearly there. I think it's really worth giving some of his novels a read. I would recommend starting where I started, which is when I studied Never Let Me Go. This is probably his most famous work, and I do think it's a really great place to start. But I also think Clara and the Sun, which I read last year, is also a really great place to start because that kind of talks more about AI and technology advancement and all of that aspect, which I think is so much in conversation right now that it might be a good place to start if you're interested in that. But if you're really sick of it, then maybe go read one of his other novels. The Buried Giant is also really interesting in terms of looking at memory, and it has more of a fantasy setting, so that might also be a bit more interesting if you're not as interested in kind of learning that kind of technological side. And same with The Pale View of the Hills is more about, it's a bit more grounded in reality and people's like personal experience. But yeah, I think he's fantastic, and I think he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, so I'm not the only one who thinks that he can write. And another pick, which is actually a classic, is this year I read Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. I've been meaning to read this for a while. One thing to know about this poetry collection is there was tea. There is so much literary tea that revolves around this poetry collection. It's really worth reading around the poetry as well and finding out about that. I might do a whole other video about it because I can't get into it because I'll be here for ages. But it is so interesting. A lot of writers in the UK, for example, that's mainly the angle that I'm coming from with it, read this poetry collection because it was so popular at the time, but it was also so scandalous. So I think also if you want to get hyped up to read a classic, personally, nothing will make me want to read something more than finding out it was banned or that people hated it, because when people have such a visceral reaction to something, it's so interesting to know why they felt like that. And often with history, it's something that made some change in society, or that changed how people wrote, which makes it incredibly interesting. But as a poetry collection, it's a really good read. It's a lot about kind of desire and people's relationship with their bodies, other people's bodies. And I really enjoyed it. I think it's really easy to read as well. I think poetry can be quite intimidating. I didn't really choose any poetry modules when I was at university. I'm more into um, looking at novels rather than poetry. But I do really like reading it, and I think it's fun when you're an adult and you can just read some poetry and you can just not understand it, and it really doesn't matter. Like, you can just read it and be like, cool, I didn't get that one, and then you can move on. Or you can make your own opinion on what it's about, and you don't need to check if that's what they meant. You can just decide that that's what it's about, because it's very valid that you understood that from it, and that's okay. So yeah, I think I read it on a train, and it took me maybe an hour, a couple of hours. So I definitely recommend giving it a read. It looks quite long, but when you actually open it, um, it's not, yeah, it's not loads of words. But yeah, it's fairly simple language, so it's not too difficult to read. But really good, really interesting. Um, Finally, on to my best book of the year, which I actually read at the start of the year, so it really set the tone, and I have just didn't top it all year. I came in, read that, and went, that's the best one thing I've read. So I looked at my Storygraph review of it before I made this video, and I wrote that it was unique and deeply disturbing, which really sums it up. It is a very unique voice. I think it can be really hard to get that kind of internet culture inspired voice in literature and it not be cringe. But I think this novel did a really good job of that. And that is I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel. Um, this is about a woman who kind of has this obsession with this guy and ends up kind of stalking his girlfriend, and has these. It's a novel about obsession, but really it's about that kind of insecurity, or the kind of what's happening in someone's life that leads them to be stalking people online, to be, trying to get into other people's lives, to be obsessed with other people. And I think what is so interesting about this is that you read it and you think the main character is not okay. They're not having a good time. They're not in a good mental state. But they come out with some passages in this are so relatable, and so powerful, and it's such a great balance of thinking, this person sounds, their logic is completely flawed, and you don't know what the hell they're thinking, but at the same time, you kind of do know what they're thinking, because it may be flawed logic, but you understand the thought process that's leading them to doing the things that they're doing, and you kind of understand the emotion behind it, because I think everyone's felt those feelings to a lesser extent, of feeling, inadequate, of comparing themselves to others, and this is like the extreme version of that. And yeah, it's really really beautiful. There's a couple of passages that I underlined, which were the ones that I really related to. Yeah, so the end of this section says, except I'm not anything to him and nothing to myself, which is why I stay. And he enjoys all of us, gets something whole out of a multitude of people, and I put up with it because a bit of him is better than nothing at all. And I think it's just such a great representation of how people get sucked into toxic relationships, how they become toxic people as well. It was just I just ate it up. It's quite a short novel, but I just hadn't read anything like it, and that's really when I will rate something 5 stars, is when I just can't think of anything else that it's similar to. I just think this is its own thing, and that makes it so fascinating to me. But be warned, it is weird, but it is also very like wrapped up in kind of the cultural conversation right now and like cultural insecurities. So that also makes it, yeah, both relatable and crazy. But yeah, so those were my top books of the year. I'm hoping 2020 2026 will be a great year for books as well. I'm probably going to read less books this year because I'm working on writing quite a lot this year, but I'm also being quite picky about what I'm going to read. So I've already read some good books this year, and I will be doing this again. But like I said, I didn't actually have any that were kind of my worst books. So it was a really, really great year for me for reading, and hopefully some of these will inspire you to pick up some great books in 2026. There's quite a mix. I read quite a lot of books over the year, so hopefully there is something for everyone. Let me know in the comments what your favourite book of the year was, and if you've already read something great in 2026. And like this video if you enjoyed it and you want to see more of my work, you can subscribe. I'm hoping to do some more videos in 2026. And yeah, keep reading.